Hello again, class. Mr. Burnett again. All right, so we finished up our lessons on the Civil War. And obviously the Civil War gets all the notice and publicity and attention. But the Reconstruction era that comes after the Civil War, in many ways, is almost just as important because it really sets the stage for what the results of the Civil War are going to end up being, and how we tried to rebuild the country after the war, and what the various goals of the people on both sides, the Union and Confederacy, what their goals were for recreating the country after the war. One thing it's important to realize is that the South was in absolute ruins after the Civil War. All right, you see some of these pictures on the right. Those are all of different cities. You can see in this bottom left corner right here, that's a railroad track that had been torn up. Remember, we talked about Sherman's total warfare and his march to the sea. And one of the things he did was he tore up the railroad tracks so that the South couldn't, get reinforcements to Lee up in Virginia and send food back and forth to each other and that sort of thing. All right, so the South was in real ruins. Banks had failed. Their currency was worthless. After all, what good is having currency from the Confederate States of America when there no longer is a Confederate States of America? The war had destroyed railroads, as I just pointed out, farms, homes, even cities. Many cities were burned. All right, remember, Sherman's march to the sea did a lot to physically destroy the South. And food prices were very high. Again, a lot of land and farms had been destroyed. A lot of farmers had gone off to fight the war. Pretty much every adult male at one point or another in the South had been drafted or had joined the Army voluntarily. And so, they weren't growing a lot of food during the war. And what food they were growing sometimes was taken by the Northern Army, or the farms were destroyed. And so food prices were high, food was scarce, buildings, railroads, and everything was in destruction. So again, as I mentioned, why the Reconstruction is so important, because it gets to this question: is it going to be a new beginning, or is it going to be more of the same? And as we'll see, it's a little bit of both. First of all, let's talk about that term Reconstruction, because there's both a literal meaning to it and a figurative meaning to it. Literally, based on those pictures we saw on the last slide, the country, particularly the South, had to be rebuilt. Right? Railroads had to be rebuilt or repaired. Buildings had to be rebuilt. All right, so Reconstruction, in one sense, is a very literal term. It is reconstructing and doing construction on the country's buildings and cities and railroads. It also has a more figurative meaning in that you're going to reconstruct the country as a whole. Instead of having two different countries, so to speak, the United States and Confederate States, you're going to put all the states back together, including those 11 Confederate states, and create a unified country again. All right, so that's the more figurative meaning of Reconstruction. And finally, and this is going to be the most contentious, and in a way, this question is not going to be decided for another 100 years. But part of Reconstruction was deciding the fate and treatment of the former slaves. All right. Through the Emancipation Proclamation, Lincoln had freed slaves in Confederacy. As we'll learn later in this lesson, he and Congress are going to adopt the 13th Amendment, which is going to outlaw slavery throughout the country. But you still have the questions. Okay, now you have 4 million former slaves that are free. They're not slaves anymore, but they've never been paid for their work. It's been illegal to teach them to read or write. And so, what are you going to do, and how are you going to treat them? And obviously, it's not going to come as a surprise to you. The northern states and many members of the Republican Party, Lincoln's party, had very different ideas than the former Confederate states. And so what's going to happen is, on one hand, Reconstruction is going to include huge gains in civil and political rights for African Americans. All right, so look at this picture on the left here. It's called the first vote. On one hand, African Americans, these former slaves, were allowed to vote for the first time. All right, this is a huge gain in terms of their liberty, their political rights. But on the other hand, you're going to have a huge backlash. All right, and so if you look at this picture on the right, and the title of this picture is "This is a White Man's Government," because many people in the country, and particularly in the former Confederate states, are going to fight back. They're going to be angry that African Americans are taking part in the political process, not only voting, but actually being elected to office in many cases. And so they're going to fight back. This is when the Ku Klux Klan is created. This is when Jim Crow laws, which during the Reconstruction period are called Black Codes. These are when these laws were implemented, basically creating a segregated society that would last for another 100 years until the Civil Rights Movement led by Martin Luther King in the 1950s and 60s began. All right, so Reconstruction offers hope, but ultimately it also offers a violent backlash against that hope. And that's the story we're going to be focusing on, not just in this, but in our prior or our future lessons on Reconstruction. Okay, first I want to talk about part of Reconstruction under Lincoln. Now, as we talked on our last Civil War lecture, the Civil War ended. Lee surrendered to Grant on April 9th, 1865, and Lee is assassinated on April 14th. So Lincoln really only had about 5 days in a post-war environment. But we can see, based on decisions and laws and acts put into place by Lincoln and Congress, even before the war ended, we can get an idea of some ideas about how Lincoln thought about Reconstruction and what his plans were for the future. Now, on one hand, you may be able to argue that the roots of Reconstruction can be found way back in 1862, well before it was clear that the Union was going to win the war. Remember, we talked about the turning points of the war, the simultaneous Union victories at Vicksburg and Gettysburg. That was in July of 1863. But way back in 1862, the Union government takes some actions that, although not officially part of Reconstruction officially starts in 1865. But these acts taken by the United States and Lincoln back in 1862 give some idea of their planning for a post-war society. First of all, they passed the Homestead Act of 1862. This gave very cheap land in the West to anyone, and importantly, regardless of race, gender, or nationality, who would settle on this land. And they had to pay a fee to apply for land, but it was virtually free. If you paid your fee and agreed to live on it, I believe it was for 5 years, the land was almost free to you. And so you can see Lincoln and Congress was planning for what they were going to do after the war and their goals after the war. Because if you'll remember all of our lessons on westward expansion, the United States had expanded from the Appalachian Mountains in the 1780s all the way to the Pacific Ocean by the 1840s. But although you'd had large numbers of people migrating first to Oregon, then to California in the 1840s, The fact is, the vast majority of people in the United States still lived east of the Mississippi River, and that land, much of that land between the Mississippi River and California, wasn't really settled by the United States. You, of course, had Native Americans living on it, but the Americans hadn't moved into that land, and Lincoln and Congress wanted to encourage people to move and start populating that land. So they were envisioning, this time period after the war. The second act that they passed in 1862 was called the Morrill Act, also known as the Land Grant College Act. And this gave each state land from the federal government. The federal government gave each state land where the state could establish agricultural and mechanical colleges. Today we call them A&Ms, A&M colleges. All right, so you can see that even well before the war was over, and well before it was even clear that the North was going to win, Lincoln and Congress had planned for a future where we're going to try to increase land ownership among the population, try to increase education as a way to helping out, people. Now, the fact is, we'll never know how different Reconstruction would have gone had Lincoln lived. Like I say, he only outlived the war by all of 5 days. So we won't know what happened because in our next lecture, we're going to talk about how Congress and the Republican Party, particularly a group called the Radical Republicans, really fought with Lincoln's successor, Andrew Johnson. That will be in our next lecture, but we're going to see that things did not go well between the president and the legislative branch after Lincoln died. And we're not going to know what would have happened if Lincoln lived. He may have had some of those same problems, but we just don't know how he would have dealt with them. But we do know he took 3 big acts, or at least 3 big acts were started and he supported during his lifetime that do give an indication of his goals for Reconstruction. First, he really wanted to forgive the South. He was all about putting the Union back together as quickly as possible. This is called the 10% plan. I'll explain that on the next slide. Second, he wanted, and Congress wanted to assist the former slaves, and in that they created what's called the Freedmen's Bureau. We'll also talk about that in this lecture. And finally, outlawing slavery via the 13th Amendment. All right, so the rest of this lecture, we'll talk about each of those 3 items. Okay, the 10% plan. Officially, it's called the Proclamation of Amnesty and Reconstruction. All right, so way back in December of 1863. Now, again, the war is going to last for another 15, 16 months after this, but by December of 1863, the Union had their victories at Vicksburg and Gettysburg. They'd reached the turning point, and they were starting to become more confident that they were ultimately going to prevail in the war. So Lincoln sets out his plan for putting the country back together after the war. And he wanted to pardon. Pardon is an official legal term for basically forgive. To legally forgive, i.e. not punish or not arrest for treason, that sort of thing. Lincoln wanted to pardon all Confederates except the very highest ranking officials. And he wanted Confederate states to be able to rejoin the Union as soon as 10% of its voters swore an oath of loyalty. That's where it gets named the 10% plan. All right, so if you look on your graphic here, I put up on the screen, you can see how little 10% is of a total population. As long as 1 out of every 10 people in a southern state said, yeah, okay, I'm loyal to the U.S. now, Lincoln was going to let that state back into the country, even if 90% of the people were still hostile to the Union. However, he was going to require that the state guarantee freedom for former slaves. Now, back in December 1863, he wasn't focused so much as in guaranteeing complete civil and political rights. but he at least wanted to make sure that slavery ended before any state came back into the Union. Now, as we'll talk about a lot more in the next lecture, members of his own party aren't going to like this plan. Now we're going to talk about it a whole lot more when we talk about the fights that Andrew Johnson had with the radical Republicans. However, even while Lincoln was alive, his own party basically rebelled against this plan a little bit because they very much wanted to punish the South. I mean, this was causing hundreds of thousands of deaths, injuries, even more than that. It was destroying land, requiring millions and millions of dollars. They wanted to punish many people in the North wanted to punish the South for this war. And these members became known as radical Republicans. In 1864, Congress passed what is called the Wade-Davis Bill. And in this bill, they were going to require a majority of voters. All right, think back to the slide back here. Remember, okay, in this orange little bit, that's all Lincoln wanted. 10% of the voters were loyal. You can come back in. But the Wade-Davis Bill says no, 51%, a majority has to swear loyalty to the Union. And they were going to forbid Confederate officials from ever voting or holding office again. So this is a lot harsher of a plan on the South than Lincoln's 10% plan. Now, in the end, Lincoln refused to sign this legislation. All right, as you'll remember when we talked about the Constitution and the three branches of government and all that, Congress writes the laws, but the president typically has to sign them for them to go into effect. Lincoln refused to sign this legislation, so the Wade-Davis Bill never went into law. Nonetheless, Lincoln is reelected in November 1864. He's sworn into office in March of 1865 during his inauguration. As all presidents do, they give a speech. And in his second inaugural address, he came up with this very famous phrase, "with malice toward none, with charity for all." All right, so he's signaling right here that he does not want to act maliciously toward the South. He doesn't want to be vindictive or seek revenge or try to punish them. He wants to act with charity towards them. All right? So again, you see that Lincoln is very much willing to basically somewhat forgive and forget. All right? His whole plan throughout the Civil War was to keep the Union together. So his plan for after the Civil War is to get the Union back together again, somewhat as if nothing had happened, although he was insisting that slavery ended. But he wanted the states to become full functioning members of the United States again. That was always his ultimate goal, to keep the country together like it had been before the war started. So he wants to act with malice toward none and charity for all. But he was assassinated within a month of giving the speech. All right, the second thing that happened while Lincoln was still alive was the creation of the Freedmen's Bureau. Now, Lincoln and Congress created it in March of 1865, right about the time he was giving his malice toward none, charity for all speech. And its purpose was to assist the recently freed slaves. I already discussed the plight that they were facing. They hadn't been paid for a lifetime's worth of work. They weren't allowed to, they had never been allowed to go to school to learn how to read or write. And so just putting them out on their own and having them, have to find their own homes, find their own jobs, was a pretty daunting task. So throughout its existence, the Freedmen's Bureau, bureau is just another name for like an agency or department. The Freedmen's Bureau helped feed millions of African Americans. They built hospitals. They provided medical care to former slaves. All right, so you see in the picture I included, that's a Freedmen's Hospital ambulance. So yes, we did have ambulances even before we actually had automobiles. It's just they were pulled by a horse. The Freedmen's Bureau also gave legal assistance to former slaves because remember, they can't read and write, and they've never had a job. They've never been hired to do work. They've never been paid for the work that they were forced to do as slaves. And so they get out. It's going to be pretty easy for them to be taken advantage of in terms of entering into contracts for the work and that sort of thing. So the Freedmen's Bureau is there to give them legal assistance and try to help them with their labor contracts, labor disputes when they were being treated unfairly. And that was the Freedmen's Bureau's goal, certainly. Perhaps the Freedmen's Bureau's most lasting impact was in education. It built thousands of schools, elementary schools, primary, secondary schools, high schools, colleges, universities. And some of those universities still exist today. I've included a picture of Howard University there in the left. That college, that's in DC. That still exists, along with colleges like Hampton University, Virginia, Fisk University. These universities still exist today. They go back to the creation during Reconstruction. And so that's probably the Freedmen's Bureau's most lasting impact. Now, unfortunately, the Freedmen's Bureau only lasted 7 years, and it was usually underfunded and understaffed during its entire existence. And part of the problem is that it certainly faced a lot of resistance in southern states, as you would probably expect. But even Lincoln's successor, Andrew Johnson, and we'll talk about him more in our next lecture, Andrew Johnson was not a big supporter of the Freedmen's Bureau. And so you have this government agency that's part of the executive branch, but the chief executive, the president, isn't supporting the agency, which explains why it's going to be so underfunded and understaffed. So ultimately, the Freedmen's Bureau really has a hard time carrying out its goals. Now, it did start all those schools, and some did ultimately exist, but ultimately, it really wasn't able to carry out all the goals. And it was disbanded in 1872, far before the effects of the Civil War and the need for help for these former slaves had ended. The Freedmen's Bureau ended well before the need for help, in other words. And as you can see in this painting, it met a lot of resistance, sometimes violent resistance, as shown in this painting in the South. The South, and this is a good time to interject, the South really resented people from the North coming down and kind of running their states for them for a while, helping the former slaves. And they called these people carpetbaggers because they thought their big briefcases and suitcases looked like they were made out of carpet. So they were called carpetbaggers. That was not meant to be a flattering term. They said that very much as an insult. And so the South really resented these people coming in from the North and trying to change how the South operated. And so there was a lot of resentment, and this painting shows the effects of some of that resentment and out attacks and arson on these Freedmen's Bureau schools. All right, the third thing we want to talk about, the third part of Reconstruction that started under or during Lincoln's life, is the 13th Amendment. All right, so let's review back to a few lectures ago where we talked about the Emancipation Proclamation. That was a wartime measure that only applied to the Confederate States. But now that the Confederacy was no longer in existence, there was going to be perhaps a fear that what does the Emancipation Proclamation mean in those former Confederate states. We already know it doesn't have any effect on the United States, the states that never left the Union. In at least 4 of those states, slavery still is technically legal. So the Emancipation Proclamation doesn't go far enough. And Lincoln and the Republicans in Congress think the Constitution is going to have to be amended if you're going to permanently ban slavery everywhere in the United States. So in January 1865, Congress passed the 13th Amendment, which outlaws slavery in the U.S. So Lincoln lived to see it pass through Congress. He did not live to see it actually ratified and officially become part of the Constitution, because it would take the rest of 1865 before the 3/4 of the states that are necessary to ratify an amendment did in fact ratify the 13th Amendment. That took place in December of 1865, which is several months after Lincoln had been assassinated. But nonetheless, Lincoln worked to get this bill or this amendment through Congress. And so even though we can argue about the total scope and effect of the Emancipation Proclamation, ultimately Lincoln does work towards achieving freedom for slaves throughout the United States on a permanent basis. So that's a fitting way to end the discussion of Lincoln's role in Reconstruction and sort of act as a legacy. In our next lecture, we're going to talk about his successor, Andrew Johnson, who does not get along with radical Republicans in Congress. And then the Southern states also do not get along with the radical Republicans. And we'll talk about how that affects the course of Reconstruction over the coming years.